And I too rise to support this bill. Would come as no surprise to anyone in this place that I am a strong advocate for same-sex marriage. I think it's long overdue, and I would want to see foreign marriages recognised. And it was interesting to listen to Senator Bernardi's contribution this morning, because he did touch on Australians' sovereign rights and said that if we moved on this bill and we allowed foreign marriage to be recognised in this country, that it would create inconsistencies. But what I want to do this morning is draw heavily on the dissenting report of Senator Carol Brown, who also was at the inquiry into this bill, and her report shows very clearly that there are already inconsistencies about how particularly same-sex couples are treated with a foreign marriage certificate in Australia. So those inconsistencies are already there, and they absolutely start to impinge upon the rights of individuals to operate fully in our society. And of course it is an absolute inconsistency that I can choose as a young woman. I got married in Britain, lived there for quite a few years, and on my return to Australia my marriage was fully recognised. Those rights just automatically transferred. And Senator Moore this morning, and I'm sure other senators—
Excuse me, sorry, Senator Lyons. I would ask senators at least, please, allow me to hear the contribution being made by other senators. Senator Lyons.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. And I know that Senator Moore and I'm sure other senators may have touched on the tragic case of David Bulmer Rizzi, who recently was killed in South Australia. Now, what's really tragic about that case is I'm sure even those who don't support marriage equality would recognise that this was a genuine relationship, that they were genuinely in love, and they wanted to celebrate that love through a formal marriage, which, of course, being British citizens, they were entitled to do and did so. And when people get married or they engage in a civil union, whatever they're choosing, they seek to celebrate that. And so as part of that celebration, the couple decided to come to Australia on their honeymoon to continue to celebrate their love and their union in a way that many of us in this country choose to do. What, of course, nobody imagined is that during that honeymoon, Mr David Bulmer Rizzi would unfortunately lose his life in a freak accident. Now, what happened there? Imagine, well, you can't really imagine the loss of a partner, but we can all, I think, understand that that would be absolutely horrific, made worse in a foreign country, away from family and friends who are there to support you. But what happened then was truly, truly tragic, because at the end of this, the death certificate does not record David as being a married man. So the final insult to this couple, the tragic to lose your partner and then to not have Australia be able to recognise that he was a married man, would be something, I think, that would sadden you for the rest of your life, that the person that you loved more than anyone else in the world, that you recognised, and indeed the British government and the British people recognised as your husband, that couldn't be put on to your death certificate in Australia. Something that for me was a given, having married in Britain and come back here, having that marriage simply continue on, and all of the legal rights that came with that marriage, in my case to be recognised, in the case of David's to be not recognised. That's an inconsistency right there in front of us. That then goes to the heart of unfairness and the heart of what most Australians, I think, would regard as an absolute injustice. That final piece, that final legal document, didn't have married on it. That's the ultimate tragedy. There's also the story of two gentlemen who moved to Pennsylvania in New York City Bill Novak was 78 and Norman MacArthur was 76. Now, again, this is a US example but could equally apply here in Australia. Their domestic partnership was not recognised, and they went to the extraordinary length in order to enable those rights which those of us who can marry take for granted to be recognised. Mr Novak adopted Mr MacArthur as his son. Now, everybody knows that's farcical, but imagine being forced to go to that length, just to make sure that your partner had rights under the law. This is what's being denied when we don't recognise, when we don't allow marriage equality. There are inconsistencies in the law, and that's a tragic circumstance to make this farcical arrangement of pretending that someone is your adopted son, so that those legal rights about having access to someone if they're taken into hospital. Hospitals are very strict about next of kin and so on and so forth. And at that point, when someone's ill, you do not want to have to then fight the bureaucracy to have your rights recognised. So that was an extraordinary length that they went to. There was also marriage equality tells the story of Julianne, who married in 2006 overseas, and the minute she stepped back onto Australian soil, her marriage was not recognised. As I said earlier, the minute I stepped back onto Australian soil, my marriage was recognised. And still today, you know, that marriage is dissolved and divorced and what have you, but I still have the choice about whether I marry or whether I remain in a de facto. I mean, you know, again, we do need to modernise our Marriage Act, because the word de facto really does quite offend me. But I have that choice. And yet many of my friends who are in same-sex relationships, all of my friends who are in same-sex relationships in Australia, are denied the same rights as I have. And so what we saw through the Senate inquiry, and as I said earlier, I'm drawing on the work of Senator Brown here. Again, Senator Bernardi didn't go quite far enough with what the Senate inquiry did discover, because there are countries who don't recognise marriage within their own systems but do recognise foreign marriages to alleviate the sorts of minefields that people then encounter the minute that they want to be recognised as a spouse or the partner, often at a hospital or on a death certificate. So countries already who don't have marriage equality as part of their sovereignty recognise overseas marriages so that people have that smooth transition. And of course we know now that many countries have moved to look at marriage equality. And this issue of marriage being between a man and a woman, it's only been in the Marriage Act for 10 years. So it's a relatively new part of the Marriage Act, and, you know, as we know, brought in by former Prime Minister John Howard, but it's not as if it's been there forever and a day. It hasn't been. That definition was only put in 10 years ago, so it's not something that is like our Constitution, is enshrined and is very much part of who we are. That definition has only been in the Marriage Act for 10 years. So again, we do have countries that, whilst they haven't yet moved to marriage equality, do recognise foreign marriages. And of course, those foreign marriages, when you now get married as a same-sex person and you come back into Australia, your marriage is recognised under some level of Australian law, but really it's recognised as either a civil union or a de facto relationship. So in Tasmania, the relationship recognition scheme does recognise foreign same-sex marriages, but as local civil unions, so changing that definition, changing your legal entitlements. So it does mean that same-sex couples in Tasmania married under foreign law have the same rights as married couples, but not that same legal definition. And that's because, of course, the state can't do that because this is a federal law. But when you start to look at what each state does, you start to see the inherent inconsistencies. And certainly, if a couple, a Tasmanian couple who had their foreign marriage recognised, moved to South Australia, for example, it wouldn't be recognised. So we have this massive inconsistency across the country where one state jurisdiction recognises everything and gives under state law 100% access to law and rights, and other states don't. And that's completely unacceptable and is an inconsistency. So there's been policy changes in Australia to enable Australian citizens to enter into same-sex marriage under foreign laws, because some foreign countries that allow same-sex marriage have obviously different rules about what you need to do in order to make your marriage lawful under their laws. So there are a number of countries which require proof that there's no impediment to marriage, and those of us that have been married know that those words are something to the effect of, does anybody object? Well, some countries require proof. And so the Commonwealth Government has now moved to give those same-sex couples certification that there's no impediment to their marriage, which is going to take place in a foreign country. Now, again, we see this sort of pseudo-recognition that this couple is going to be taking on a formal marriage in another country, and so the Commonwealth now assists by giving a certification saying there's no impediment to marriage. Now, again, another inconsistency. We don't have marriage equality in this country. We don't recognise those foreign marriages once the people come back to Australia, but we have smoothed the way and we provide a certificate to say there's no impediment to those that same-sex couple getting married. The impediment occurs the minute they step back, wanting their foreign marriage to be recognised, even though Australia, under the Commonwealth, has enabled that to happen through the issuing of the no impediment certificate. And you'd have to, this is a minefield. Again, another inconsistency, that we would enable that marriage to take place by issuing this certificate, but the minute that couple comes back to Australia, bang, we don't recognise the marriage. I mean, that's sheer madness. That's really something out of Yesminister. That's bureaucracy gone crazy, that we do one thing to enable the marriage, but then the impediment comes when you step back in. So, of course, as we know, and Senator Bernardi talked about this, you can now, as an Australian citizen, go to the British consulate to have your marriage recognised there. So if you've got dual nationality, you can go to the British consulate in Canberra or wherever they exist in Australia and be married. Now, you are standing in Australia. Sure, you're in a foreign embassy. The minute you step outside of that door, just a few steps away, your marriage is suddenly null and void and no longer recognised. I mean, that again is bureaucracy gone mad, and again another inconsistency, that whilst you're in that embassy office you are recognised as a married person, and the minute you take 2 or 3 steps outside and back onto Australian soil, Australian law doesn't recognise that foreign marriage. Again, complete madness. So, of course, we know since New Zealand has introduced the ability for same-sex couples to marry, that many Australians have gone over there to be married. And indeed, 2 good friends of mine from Western Australia, in the few moments that we had marriage equality here in the ACT, and well known to you, Mr Acting Deputy President Stephen and Dennis, came over here, and I think were one of the first couples that were married. But of course that was very short-lived, and even here in Australia that law was unfortunately overturned, and while Stephen and Dennis were married for a short time, now there's no formal recognition other than what Western Australia offers in relation to civil unions. So we know that Australians who want to marry and who can't marry here are going to New Zealand in significant numbers to be able to at least have a marriage certificate that acknowledges them as a couple. So it is quite incongruous that in spite of policy changes that enable same-sex couples to marry under foreign laws and the recognition of foreign same-sex marriage as civil unions or de facto partnerships under state and Commonwealth laws, these unions are still not legally considered marriage under Australian law. I mean, just trying to get your head around that is crazy. And so the law treats same-sex couples differently. And certainly during the Senate inquiry, a number of submissions raised concerns about the interaction between some foreign marriage laws and the state and territory relationship recognition schemes, some of which cut right across that relationship. So, for example, we see that, in effect, Australian same-sex couples are being forced to choose between the practical protections offered to the recognition of their relationship under an Australian scheme, you know, that they become the next of kin, that they are recognised in relation to immigration, legal recognition when not living under one roof, etc., or to have their relationship appropriately recognised, as they see it, by being legally married under the British scheme. But the British scheme forces Australians to make a choice, because under the British law, being in a civil union is seen as an impediment. So you are faced, if you're in a civil union, you have a civil union, under Australian law, you have to renounce that in a sense in order to take up marriage. And this is, again, an inconsistency, and it's treating people differently because of the nature of their relationship. So if you're a same-sex person, you have to, and you want to marry your partner, you have to make that choice. And again, it's ridiculous, and there's obvious legal hurdles that you have to go through. So it's forcing people to face the choice of having substantive rights through having an Australian certificate or having the dignity and respect of marriage with none of the rights. So here we are. If you want to be married and you have dual citizenship, you could be married under British law, which presumably gives you some dignity, but you would have to let go of any rights that you had through a civil union in Australia. So that's the situation people are faced with. So it's not just a matter of saying we are deeply in love and we want to make this lifelong commitment to one another, and we want to do that through marriage. It's not as simple as that, as it is for you and I to make that commitment. It's much more complicated if you're in a same-sex relationship. And again, that's that inherent unfairness that really I rail against. It is not appropriate, it is not right, it is not just to make those distinctions between one person and me based on my sexual preference or their sexual preference. It is not right, and certainly in 2016 we should be a lot further along in this debate than we already are. And of course, Senator Bernardi mentioned the plebiscite, and it would seem that despite Mr Turnbull being an advocate of same-sex marriage, we are going to have this very expensive and unnecessary plebiscite, which people like Senator Bernardi have already said they're not going to support if it comes back an overwhelming yes. But of course, what's at the crux of this is what will the question be? What will the question be? And we have no certainty that it's going to be a fair and a just question. We all know, certainly on this side of politics, that that question can be manipulated so that we get a no vote. So again, saying the plebiscite will decide where we go on marriage equality. I'm sorry, I don't have that faith. So I would urge the Senate to support this bill to recognise foreign marriage, not on the basis of morality, but simply to get rid of those inconsistencies, those legal minefields that people face, and to bring justice to David, quite frankly. Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President.